Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Zoya and I'm here today to present to you my Global Action Plan, which focuses on increasing access to inexpensive healthcare, specifically in Karachi, Pakistan. So before I start, I just wanted to talk a little about the template I chose. And so I picked one that was a mountain because I'm going to be talking about kind of my journey throughout the year and like how I got to the culmination of my Global Leadership Diploma. So before I begin, I wanted to discuss a bit about my personal connection to this project and why I chose healthcare in Pakistan specifically out of all the things that I could have. So I grew up in Karachi, Pakistan. So Karachi is a city in Pakistan, and it's actually the most populous city in the country. And this is a picture of what you could call downtown Karachi. When I lived in Pakistan, because I was born and raised there, I've obviously seen and been exposed to the healthcare system. And specifically when I saw a government hospital was when I was around 12 and I was volunteering in one. And I was exposed to really terrible conditions. And so I went home and I was telling my grandma about it. And I realized that my grandpa, when he was ill, she told me that he was actually being treated in that hospital. So I was amazed by how bad the conditions were. But she told me that someone in my family had actually been there. So I realized that it's not that uncommon and that people close to me actually face those kinds of conditions. And what really kind of influenced me to pursue my Global Leadership Diploma is that I've not only lived in Pakistan, but I've also lived in Canada, Dubai, the US. And so I've seen conditions like that, which I'll go on to tell you what I mean. But I've also seen hospitals like in Canada. So I really wanted to focus on improving healthcare within Pakistan. And so a large part of the issue is actually that public healthcare in Pakistan, as I said, is often of very poor quality and conditions, but private healthcare is really unaffordable for people. So people can't always afford to go to private hospitals, which may offer them better services. And so another connection that I had to this is that in the future I intend to pursue a career in the field of science and specifically biology, which may lead to medicine. So because of that, I have a really personal connection to that subject as well. So aside from just me seeing public hospitals in Pakistan, I also wanted to ensure that there was an actual need for my Global Action Plan. And so throughout the year, I've been conducting research on Pakistan's healthcare sector. And a quote that I thought really summed up well the need for my Global Action Plan is this one. And it's that it is the lack of accessible healthcare, not terrorism, drones, or the energy crisis, which is what we think are probably much larger issues, that is the greatest adversity facing Pakistan. And the reason for this is actually quite simple, yet really complex at the same time. And the first is that Pakistan has very poor resource allocation and that there's very limited government spending in the healthcare sector. So as you can see on this graph, over the past it shows Pakistan's health expenditure over the past 20-something years. And it starts off really low, and it looks like the graph is going upward, but it actually starts off at only 0.65% of Pakistan's GDP in 1995 was spent on healthcare. And although it looks like it's going up until 2014, Pakistan only spent 0.9% of its GDP on healthcare, and that's very, very, very little. And so the problem with this is not just that it's very low, but there's not a lot of improvement. So it's clear that the government isn't really focusing on this sector right now and kind of bringing about change in that. Because of that, hospitals in Pakistan often look like this, and actually it was hard to kind of find pictures, so the conditions are often a lot worse than the ones shown in these photos. But as you can see, it's not, I would say, how you would really expect a hospital to be. There's people everywhere. The conditions aren't the most sanitary. But like I said, it's generally even worse than this. So this is just an example of 2 government hospitals in Pakistan. And a further issue is actually that it's not just that public hospitals offer poor quality services, but it's also that they're not very accessible. So this image describes the number of private hospitals in urban, rural, and overall areas in Pakistan, and then also public hospitals. And you can see that in all regions, the number of public hospitals is far less than the number of private hospitals, which means that even if people are okay with dealing with bad conditions, they often don't actually have access to public healthcare close by. And so because of that, 75% of Pakistanis have to end up resorting to private healthcare. And as I said, they often end up taking out loans because it's unaffordable. Now, this leads to this is connected to a lot of other issues as well, which is that majority of surgeons in Pakistan don't actually keep a record of their mortality rates. And a lot of hospitals in Pakistan perform procedures for which they're unequipped and they're not supposed to perform them. And again, that's because of the lack of hospitals available and the sheer number of people that come to them. And so because of these sorts of issues, there's very limited trust in the public healthcare sector, which again leads to the fact that people end up using private healthcare. And what's actually even worse is that even within the private sector, there's not a lot of rules and regulations because there's no kind of centralized authority that can control that. And so because of that, within both the public and private healthcare sectors, it's a little messy. So my solution is what I've kind of been focusing on developing this year. And I think it's really important that I acknowledge that this is a very complex and it's a very deep-rooted issue, deep-rooted political, economic, social issues within Pakistan that will actually need to be solved. And I don't think that I can solve those single-handedly over the next 5 years, especially while I'm in school. So my goal is actually to understand these issues further and to research them so that I can figure out how they can be solved. But while I do this, I want to offer a temporary solution to people who currently don't have access to great healthcare in Pakistan. And so my temporary solution is actually to open a rehabilitation center in Pakistan. And what a rehabilitation center would offer is it would offer equipment and services to people who, for example, have lost limbs or have prosthetic limbs or are on wheelchairs. And so it would offer them cognitive and therapy for their mobility so that they can be reintegrated back into society. And the reason I chose the reason I chose a rehabilitation center instead of a hospital is actually that A, I think it's a lot more feasible because it's more focused, and B, because the healthcare issue in Pakistan is so obvious, a lot of NGOs and individuals are actually focusing on opening up hospitals. So I wanted to focus on rehabilitation centers because that's something that's something that can often be overlooked. So what I plan to do is to open up a rehabilitation center that offers high quality services and equipment for little to no payment, and I'll talk a little about how I plan to do that. So essentially my global action plan has 3 parts to it, or 3 objectives. The first is to raise sufficient funds to open a rehabilitation center and to keep it running, and like a sustainable rehabilitation center. The second is to establish a partnership with a local NGO, a local non-governmental organization within Pakistan. And the one I've chosen is the Chal Foundation, which I'll talk a little more about when I'm discussing my objectives. And the third one is to actually open and sustain the rehabilitation center. Now, I've laid out kind of over the next 5 years how I plan to achieve each objective. And there's some years that are a lot more focused on one rather than the other. So for example, for my very first objective, that's something that I'm going to be doing throughout all 5 years, which is why I made it number 1. And so that's to raise enough money to actually open and run the center. And so in my first year, all I wanted to do was kind of finalize my fundraising timeline and my events and how I plan to raise this money over the next 5 years. In my second and third year, next year I'm going to be starting university at the University of California, Berkeley. So I wanted to initiate fundraising events there that would be geared towards university students and wouldn't necessarily be focused on awareness, but would be more focused on fundraising specifically. But the second part of my fundraising over those 2 years would be within Pakistan, and that would be a lot more awareness building. But also I plan to approach individuals and private donors within Pakistan that I think would be able to give me money. And then during my 4th year, during the first half, I intend to finish my fundraising and reach the goal that I need to open up the center. And during the second half, I want to obviously continue fundraising so that I can sustain the center once it's opened. And then during my 5th year, which will, by the end of my 5th year, I'll hopefully have already finished opening up the center. I hope to discuss with the Chill Foundation kind of what my future plans are like and what funds will be needed in the future to keep the center running. Now, in terms of opening up the center, I have communicated with them, but I don't have an exact sum of what I need just yet, so I'm still working on figuring that out. So my second objective was establishing a partnership with an NGO. And the NGO that I chose was the Chill Foundation, and that was kind of my overarching goal for this year in terms of this objective, was to find an organization whose mission was aligned with mine. And the Chill Foundation, actually, after I found it, they were the ones who inspired me to open a rehabilitation center rather than a hospital, because the organization is specifically focused on offering rehabilitation services. And so they actually have centers all across Pakistan, both in rural and urban areas. And so I communicated with them to figure out whether my plan was feasible and whether they were interested in it. And in my progress, when I discuss my progress, I'll talk a little more about how that went. But so in my first year, that's what I planned to do, but I also wanted to establish a plan with them about how I would open the center, or not how specifically, but just, that it would be possible. During the second year, I wasn't too focused on this objective, but just maintaining the partnership. During the third year, I wanted to finalize the logistics with them, so how I would actually open up the center, what would be required for me to do versus what they would do in the partnership. And then in my 4th year and 5th year, I actually wanted to start opening and finish opening the rehabilitation center. And then, of course, in the 5th year, discussing in the future what I want to do. Would I want to open up another center, how we're going to approach the public in order to come to the center, things like that. Now, my third and final objective was actually to open and run the rehabilitation center. And this is a lot more focused towards the culminating years of my 5-year plan, so years 4 and 5. Now, in year 1, all I wanted to do was research inadequacies in the Pakistani healthcare sector to determine what I needed to do in order to address them. And so in year 2, I'm just going to focus on fundraising. In year 3, finalize the logistics of opening the center. In year 4, I wanted to start opening it, but that also included purchasing equipment and any other necessary things that I would need to actually get the center able for people to be able to use it. And then the final year required me to finish opening the rehabilitation center, and that actually means finding people to be in it once I have the equipment, finding people, both volunteers and employees, that would be able to work in the center. So now that I've talked about how I got to the top, I wanted to talk about what my progress and my challenges have been over the past year. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a little about how I plan to start versus what I'm actually doing now. So initially, I intended to focus on the education system within Pakistan and bringing about change in that rather than healthcare. And the reason is that, honestly, both those things in Pakistan really require help. But I initially was a little conflicted with which one I wanted to do, but as I said before, because I feel personally more interested in science and in medicine, I thought that because I'm more interested in it, I'd be more likely to succeed in creating a change, which is why I decided to focus on healthcare. The second thing was, as I already described, switching from a hospital to a rehabilitation center because of feasibility, and also because of other people's focus on that at this time. The final thing is my challenges and also my progress in terms of communication. And so a few of the things that I found really challenging with my global action plan was actually communicating with people within Pakistan and approaching them and asking them whether they wanted to collaborate with me, whether my plan would work. And so what I did was, initially I reached out to the Chill Foundation just through their website and in a very general approach, but I came to realize that in Pakistan that's not really the best way to do things, and I thought I needed to to approach individuals specifically. So I contacted Javed Hassan, who's the CEO of the Hunar Foundation, which is an organization that kind of works under the same umbrella as the Chell Foundation. And so I talked to him about my plan, and so he was able to kind of give me some advice on that, but also put me in touch with the current CEO of the Chell Foundation. And so kind of through that chain, I reached Dr. Sarwar, who I then spoke to about my plan and actually collaborating with the organization itself. And that was kind of how I navigated through that challenge. The second one was finding accurate data. And so as you can even see, even in the graph I used, it was from 1995 to 2014, and there's no data from 2014 to 2017 yet. And in general, in a lot of data findings in Pakistan, they're very limited because there's, like I said, not a lot of rules and regulations. So finding and monitoring those kinds of statistics can often be difficult. And so in terms of conducting my research, it was often difficult for me to decide what I needed to focus on because I didn't have a very clear understanding of the data. And so what I decided to do was actually, instead of looking at, I did two things. So the first was that I looked at the area, not just Pakistan, but the region surrounding it. And so I also considered, for example, how healthcare is like in India or in Bangladesh, stuff like that. And then I also turned to organizations that look at or that collect data for the whole world. And so that allowed me to kind of find more accurate data that was focused on Pakistan, but collected for other countries as well. And so that was how I got through that. So thank you for listening to my global action plan, and I would love to answer any questions if you have any.
Zoya, thank you. That was terrific.
Thank you.
You know, it's a global action plan that is really nicely grounded in who you are and what your past experiences have been, but also set nicely for realistically what your future is going to be as well. I think you've set out something that's quite a challenge, which is going to accompany, when you leave here and go on to university, a challenging university program as well. But I think there's great alignment between those, and one shall help you have direction in your university career, and your university career should help to support the possibility of completing this global action plan. So really great alignment there. The question I want to ask you is around risk exposure. Lots of things pop to mind for me in terms of what you are personally going to be exposed to. What do you feel are those biggest risks that you need to keep in mind, and what have you sort of thought in terms of mitigating against those?
Of course, yeah. So I think for personal risk, there's a few, as you said. I think the first is just working in healthcare in Pakistan in general, so kind of exposing yourself to that kind of an environment with illnesses and diseases. And like I said, I do plan on hopefully opening a place that's very that has good conditions, and so I think that that would help with that. But I think also a large part of it is actually approaching people within Pakistan and exposing yourself to that kind of environment and running fundraising events, things like that. And so what I wanted to do is, initially I was actually hoping to start with people that I personally already knew, and then establishing contacts from there, so that I wasn't just going right away to meet strangers. And so that's kind of how I was hoping to mitigate that. I also think part of it is going to be getting the things that are necessary for the center, so the actual equipment and employees, things like that. And so my greatest hope with that is that I can collaborate with the foundation that actually already has previous experience with that, so they can tell me kind of how to navigate through that within Pakistan specifically. Because even though I have lived there majority of my life, I still think that that's something I haven't been exposed to. And so I'm hoping that they can help me out with that.
Great.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thusly, so we have three questioners, not four for you. Yeah.
I echo everything Mr. McGinnis said just about how well thought out the plan is, and it was really detailed, and I appreciated kind of the research you offered to us to help us understand the problem. Building off of what Mr. McGinnis was talking about with risk, I see financial risk as a big problem, or potential problem,
Yeah.
hurdle. Because beyond raising the money to get the center started, it's the sustainability of the financial
For
model.
sure.
So have you thought about, like how detailed have you got into that idea of a financial model? Do you think you'd rent a place and then or would you try to secure a donated property? And then how do you foresee would it just be individual fundraising events that would fund the sustainability, or how do you kind of get the operational costs working?
Yeah, for sure. That's a good question. So kind of too far, so I have thought about it a little, but I don't have it fully figured out. I would intend to get more property rather than rented, so that kind of would solve that issue, I think, right at the start, and that's something you wouldn't have to keep working on later. But a big part of it, I think, is finding donors that aren't just offering a one-time kind of like donation, but that are going to be giving things throughout, like while the center is running as well. And so that's why I didn't just want to run fundraising events, but also approach people individually within Pakistan. But I do think a large part of that is going to require me to talk to the organization about how they run their centers for a long period of time in terms of sustainability. So that is definitely something I do still need to figure out.
And it may be possible for you to have them, instead of it kind of being a partnership where you actually work under their umbrella, and then their kind of insurance and things would cover the liability, so it's not up to you as an individual.
Yeah, I think that is how it would be in terms of them actually helping to open it up. I think it would be under their liability. Yeah.
Am I allowed to ask another question, or do we?
Yes,
Sure.
you can.
I was just wondering
As long
about.
as you don't take it.
Okay.
No, just kidding.
Okay, mine is about Dr. Sarwar. This is more like curious. Who is Dr. Sarwar within the organization?
Oh, he's the CEO
He's
of
the
the
CEO.
organization. Yeah, so he is like the one who runs it. Yeah. I don't know how else to explain that, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking, it'd be good for you to have a partner who, who could inform you, but maybe isn't as busy as the
Yeah,
CEO.
yeah,
So maybe
for
we
sure.
could direct you to somebody who works a doctor
Yeah.
in the organization who's willing to take something on of a bit more scope like you're doing.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I thought the presentation was so clear and well articulated. I really liked that you acknowledged that these are complex and deep-rooted issues, and you said, you know what, I'm not necessarily going to solve them, I'm going to, think about them and ponder, and this is one way I can contribute. So how amazing that is with your personal ties and connections. I just had a question about sort of the earlier part of the 5-year plan. So thinking that you're going to California, Berkeley, amazing.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Some fundraising events that you might do there, because you talked a bit about fundraising more there, correct me if I'm wrong, for fundraising events, but not for awareness. And I'm wondering, maybe speak a bit more to that. Like, in the early years, obviously there'd be more donors, and I've done fundraising in the community. It's a tough sell, but you don't have to tell your story. But what are you thinking of Berkeley?
So I think I would eventually, like you said, like this is just initial, but I would want to eventually move on to awareness raising events. But initially, I think because I'm just going to be going into a new setting in a new university, I wanted to run things, and by more focused on fundraising, I mean maybe something like a musical night. So that's not actually focused on healthcare in Pakistan, but it would allow me to raise a lot of money and kind of aim towards a student population and target that, so that I would be able to not focus on awareness but fundraising. That's kind of what I meant. But events like that, so events that are focused more towards a student population.
Absolutely, and I would just say, with that, I find when fundraising, the most powerful thing you have, which you totally have, is your story and the research you've done. So maybe you were thinking this, but don't be afraid to mention like, hey, we're here for a great night of music, but here's the story, because people are so hooked by your story. It's very captivating and important. So,
Thank you.
I just wanted to make a comment. So, and in that frame, you may want to, fundraising is one of those things that I find where you had from years 1 to 3. We've talked about this in the course too, but having that sort of liability issue. So I've got a few parts. I'm just making a comment. So one is to make sure that folks will know when they give it to you that 2 years later it's going to go where it's supposed to. So thinking on where it's going to be housed, that kind of sort of all the licensing around that. I do think awareness personally. Also, though, helps people care to give the money, so that's just
For
something
sure,
to
yeah,
think of.
yeah.
But the other thing is, and I'm thinking about this more for a hospital, but a rehab center is sort of a smaller version of it, is extremely complex requirements from government approvals to research that has to, you know, community support that would, the expertise, hiring folks, getting the folks for HR, hiring, all those permissions, all the liability things around that. So it is a big challenge for you. And so just don't forget that all of those things will be at play. And it
Yeah.
will take, and so I would make sure that as you do the sort of community needs and those kinds of assessments, making sure what it takes to actually open a rehab center in Pakistan and what Karachi's rules are
Yeah.
for doing that, whether or not being a doctor would be problematic to do that or not, or whether or not that's okay to do before you get into med school.
Yeah.
And maybe even think about that for if you go to med
Yeah.
school, of doing some awareness raising when you're there. Because that's also a really great population that would
Yeah.
hopefully be really interested.
Yeah,
So yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah. No, I guess not.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you so
you.
much.